Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the All-Inclusive podcast with Jay Ruderman.
Hi, I'm Jay Ruderman. All-Inclusive is a podcast focused on inclusion and social justice. Join me as I interview leaders and experts on the latest news focused on advocacy for social justice. In order to make progress that will lead to a more equitable future, honest discussions must be held. That is what All-Inclusive is all about. Listen and subscribe to the All-Inclusive podcast on Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, and anywhere else podcasts are available. Visit the show website for more information and full episode transcripts at www.allinclusivepodcast.com.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 281, Judaism Unbinaried. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rothberg.
And today is our debrief episode where we're looking at this series of conversations that we've had with Jews of trans experience, where we've been talking about the trans experience and its implications for Judaism more broadly. Before we jump into that, I'll say that we're not going to actually ask you for money today, because we've been asking you for money a lot over the last few weeks because it was the end of our fiscal year, and today is the first episode of our new fiscal year. So we're not going to ask, but if you want to give us some money, that would be wonderful. You could be the first gift of the fiscal year, but that's all I'll say about that. And actually, what I'd like to say at this stage is for you to please start supporting some of the organizations run by our guests or that our guests have talked about in this series for sure and in other series as well. We hope that sometimes the organizations that you've only heard about for the first time really resonate with you and that those might be something to support. So just as important as supporting our work, if not more important, is to support the work of the organizations that are run by these amazing guests that we've had. So I'll leave it at that. And now to jump into that conversation with one more little preface, that I think it's important to note that when it's just Lex and me talking about our takeaways from those conversations, that's two people's takeaways. And what we really want is for you to listen to the original conversations and have your own takeaways. So hopefully our discussion is helpful, but especially in a case where neither of us is a member of the group that we're talking to in this series, it becomes more important to just note that these are some of our reactions, right? In this case, neither of us is trans. And so this is just our sense of what we're taking away from these conversations. And hopefully it helps you think, but also please, please, please always listen to the conversations themselves and take your own conclusions away from those. So Lex, I think that there's at least three major topics that I want to cover over the course of this. One is just our sense of the experience of Jews of trans experience and what that's all about and what other people might do to make that better and more holy and just more incredible and everything that it deserves to be, because everybody deserves to have an amazing Jewish experience. Also, what perhaps understanding the trans experience, or maybe the new world that might be built from the trans experience, can do for people who are not trans. And the third is really just kind of whether, almost by analogy, some of the things that we've talked about in terms of identifying them as coming out of the trans experience actually represent bigger things that are true across the board for all kinds of Jews. At least for me, I had a lot of takeaways in terms of that. So that's kind of a little bit of a roadmap for hopefully how we can put the conversation together. And I wanted to see where you thought you wanted to start.
Ooh, that's a fun privilege. I want to start by just expressing gratitude to all our guests. This unit was a set of trans voices, and to some extent we talked about what it is to be trans. But what I think is really important is that's not where the conversation ended. It's not even where, I mean, by halfway through many of these episodes, we were connecting issues of gender, questions of binaries to other kinds of Jewish topics. And I think that that's really important. I want to name that aloud and not have that just be like a structural piece of our conversations that floats on by. Because what I really am taking from this is that when we're asking the big picture questions we ask, on Judaism Unbound a lot of the time, and that anybody's asking about the future of Judaism, all of those questions are not on their face, quote unquote, transgender questions or even gender questions. But when you sit with them for even a little bit, it becomes, especially with folks who are trans, it becomes very clear that those folks have so much wisdom and in my view should be leading, not just participating in, leading those conversations. What helped me really crystallize that is two of our conversations in this unit that touched on the idea of world building. So one was with Becky Silverstein and Lainey Solomon from the organization Svara. By the way, you mentioned supporting organizations. I mean, Svara is a wonderful organization for folks who want to support them. We strongly encourage that. They talked about world building in the sense of, I mean, we talked about it in a few ways, but in the sense of crafting a system of Jewish living, whether we call it Jewish law or something else, that not only is, permissive towards people of trans experience, but actually like created by them. And so that's one piece. And then we also spoke with Leah Moser about her book, and it's a fantasy book. That's the genre. And that's another sort of literal way in which a person creates a world, is through crafting a work of fiction. And I want to suggest, I mean, not authoritatively, but I just, my inclination is that it makes sense that people who are not accepted, are not centered in Jewish life or in society writ large, where people who have their identities questioned, who have policies on the books that make them not only uncomfortable but unwelcome and sometimes subject to violence and otherwise, that those people would be logical folks to be thinking about creating worlds. Because if you are inhabiting a world where your basic existence is under question, of necessity, you are likely going to be working to craft an alternate world. And so given that you and I, who are, white cisgender men, like given that you and I desire a new Jewish world, basically, a Jewish era, whatever languaging we want to use, we want a Judaism that is sufficiently different in a sufficient number of ways that it's comparable to a new world. Like given that we want that, it is incumbent upon us and all of our listeners that hopefully are interested in those same things to be seeking out the voices of those who are specifically marginalized, whether because they're trans or whether because they're Jews of color or because they're any number, or whether they are disabled. Like those are the people that are going to lead this charge. And you and I hope, could also be part of that. But there are certain ways in which we are not going to feel in our bones certain things as obvious that to somebody who's trans or otherwise, like they just know because they've lived it.
Absolutely. And, I think it's actually more than that. And I've been struggling lately with how to articulate this. And also, like you were sort of just alluding to, how to think about my role in such a thing. But this new world has to be built by the people who were most excluded from the old world. Because if it's not, then what you end up doing is creating a new world where certain people who are excluded from the old world are still excluded. You might not be actively excluded, but are still sort of not in the core of the creation of it. And so you're back to talking about words like inclusion and toleration. And of course, we love Abby Stein's always saying that tolerance is for lactose, not people. But it feels like it's almost inevitable that if something is created by, let's say, quote, more mainstream people, then it's not going to really be fully built out of and for the experience of the people who have historically been more excluded or marginalized, et cetera. And, it makes me think about, I was very moved. It's really kind of rocked my world in a certain way in our conversation last week with Binya Koatz, where I asked something along the lines, I've been asking a bunch of the people that we've interviewed, like, why bother? Why continue to try to sort of fight to reshape Judaism, given that it doesn't talk about people like you, doesn't recognize the existence of people like you? And I can't quote Binya. I probably should have written down the quote because it's so powerful, and I think I probably will go back and do that afterwards. But my takeaway from it was she said something along the lines of, I believe that God, or, that there's a oneness of all things. And so by definition, I'm included in it. I'm part of it. And so if it just doesn't express itself that way, then I'm going to essentially bring about the true expression, which of course would have room for someone like me because I'm part of the oneness of all things. And when we talk about whether Judaism has space in it or has considered certain kinds of people, one approach that we can do is to sift through the material. And I think that we should do this, and find the cases where, for example, in the Talmud, we talked about this, does recognize other genders than the binary male and female. There is some of that in the Talmud. So it's good. It's good to find it. It's meaningful to find it, but it doesn't solve all the problems. I feel like something that's more along the lines of it potentially solves the problems is to say, I just fundamentally believe that definitionally Judaism, there's some kind of like kernel of Judaism that includes everybody, that is about everybody's experience. Unfortunately, it was given a certain user interface for the last 2,000 years, 3,000 years, that didn't actually allow it to be accessed by a certain set of people for whatever reasons, sometimes intentional, sometimes unintentional. And now we have an opportunity to sort of reshape that user interface. And that is not only not a problem, right? That is the most traditional thing, right? That is what we are called to do. So what Judaism is something dynamic that's constantly being reshaped, and that it's actually the tradition to continually reshape Judaism to make it more inclusive.
Yeah, so something that you said called me back once again to our conversation with Becky Silverstein and Lainey Solomon, and there was a point where we talked about the difference between, is it permissible, is it okay for trans folks to do X, Y, Z versus how do we form Judaisms where trans folks can do X, Y, Z? And like growing up in elementary school, if I asked any question that started with does, like the teacher would come back and say, oh, that's like a closed question. You should ask something that isn't just going to lead to a yes answer or a no answer. I agree. Like, I think that we ask too many of those. And if we started from the point of, Judaism, for our purposes, we are going to seek out Judaisms, create Judaisms that are not only inclusive of trans folks, but led by them. How do we craft those Judaisms? Not can we, how do we? And once you get to that point, everything changes. That's a question of experimentation. That's a question that you answer with, maybe this way. Maybe we try this ritual, this practice, this holiday, this text, this wisdom, this whatever. You could apply this to other issues. And I think many of our guests that we've just spoken to are the first ones who would co-sign that. Like, you could apply the idea that, can Judaism, like, we shouldn't be asking, can Judaism make space for Jews of color? Like, can our institutions? No, like, given that our institutions and our Jewish society has to adjust to center and empower and transcend the tolerance of and go beyond that Jews of color, how are we going to do that? We need an entire new ecosystem of Jewish life. How do we get there? Not, it'd be nice to have that, but we actually have to get that because there are a huge number of people who are not being served by Judaism as it is. And that's why I think when I talk to folks who are trans, I get really inspired because they're asking those questions. Even as, by the way, I don't want this to come up, like, even as many of these folks are deeply traditionalist and, they're crafting new forms of halakha, of like a traditional way of orienting to commandments and Jewish practice. Like, it's not that the takeaway from all of this is like you throw out everything of the past in favor of crafting Judaisms that are fully empowering of people that were not in the past. It's, we can actually take that on as a project and then incorporate, Talmud. The people that are leading the most inspiring, new form Talmud learning are L and G and B and T and Q folks right now. That's who's doing it. The most exciting project, Svara, of Talmud learning, one of the most traditional Jewish practices on the planet, reaching people outside of Orthodoxy that in a way that has never really happened before. Those are the people that are excited about that. So if that's the case, we need to begin asking ourselves, how do we emulate that and not how do they join us?
I hesitate to put it this way because I actually don't think it's their problem. I don't think that it's the problem of queer and trans folks to think about including us. Like, I don't think that that's their problem. But I don't want it to be, right? I don't want them to think about, people like me for a second. And yet, I find that most of what I see coming out of the trans world in terms of Jewish ideas feels to me like it works better for me than the traditional way. So, for example, you got very excited about this idea. We both got really excited about this idea of being called to the Torah instead of saying your name and Ben or Bat, the son of or the daughter of so-and-so, which would require you to identify yourself publicly as a particular gender. Instead of doing that, you can just say mi beit, meaning from the house of, and then you don't have to say any gender at all in terms of calling somebody to the Torah. And I hear that and I'm like, that's just a better way to call people to the Torah. And nobody thought of it up until now, not because there was necessarily a particular Jewish commandment to honor your father or your mother. I mean, there are, but I'm not sure that that's where the idea of this is how we call people to the Torah. I think it came more about before people had last names. That was just kind of how the world worked in terms of how you identified, this Lex versus that Lex. Mm-hmm. And so there's nothing, specifically Jewish or holy about that. Now you come up with an idea of mi beit, from the house of. That's actually a very ancient formulation. And you say, wow, that actually makes a lot of sense for everybody. And that's where I'm kind of interested in the possibility that by definition, when you are building a new world for the people and by the people who have been most marginalized by the old world, you're going to end up creating a much more inclusive world. And what's wrong with that? That's the best world. By the way, that's why I feel like our mission is mostly not to actually build new Jewish worlds, but to kind of talk about people who are building new Jewish worlds and try to put some ideas together, because I actually think ultimately the builders might be better to be other people than, again, like you said, two cis white guys. And I think I brought this up when we did other queer-based series where I talked about universal design, and it's this idea that almost by definition, if you already have a building that's built and you're trying to make it more accessible, you can make it more accessible, but there are inherent limits because the building is already built. And so if you're building a new building to be accessible or more than accessible from the very beginning, it's always going to end up more accessible than the modified building that, with all the best intentions, you tried to make more accessible. So it just feels to me like we have to translate that idea into Jewish spaces. And I don't mean buildings per se. I mean all kinds of elements of Judaism. And if we really embrace that idea of universal design applied to Judaism, I think what we would inevitably find is that it has to be driven by new organizations, by new work. That doesn't mean that the old organizations can't always and shouldn't always be making themselves more and more accessible. Of course they should. Just as any building should make itself more and more and more accessible to people with disabilities. But we should also recognize that there are going to be inherent limits. And at the end of the day, my hope is that these Jewish spaces that were not originally built by and for queer and trans folks, that they'll get more and more and more and more accessible over time. But eventually, the queer and trans-driven organizations will become so big and successful that those other organizations will be able to, close their doors and all migrate over to the other.
So universal design, that word universal is important. And it makes me think about, the universe, or at the very least, like the whole world, the globe, I don't know, whatever the right term is. And it calls back to our conversation last week about diaspora with Bina Coates. And I want to try to thread a few things. One is that, first up, diaspora, we didn't so much define diaspora. We talked about diasporism, but diaspora is just sort of, it comes from the same root as spread, that spra part of diaspora. And I don't actually know if it's Latin, Greek, but the spread of people throughout the world, but tied to a particular center in some way or another. That's where diaspora sort of comes from. And the way that diaspora has been discussed in Jewish history is largely the idea that there is, Israel, the land of Israel, and there is a global diaspora in all the other places that are in Israel. So what's funny is I identify as a diasporist, but I actually want to transcend the paradigm that diaspora is sort of defined through, because I don't want it to be about diaspora being everywhere that isn't Israel and Israel. I want a vision of Judaism where every single place that a Jew practices Judaism is sort of a Jewish homeland. And by the way, on the universal design front, that includes Israel. Like if a Jew lives in Israel, that would be part, not of diaspora necessarily, because that term doesn't really make sense in that, but it would be part of the form of Judaism I am advocating that is built on here-ness, on wherever here is for a particular Jew. And I say that in the context of this conversation about folks who are trans, because I think what the diaspora question or the here-ness conversation brings up is it's premised on a questioning of Jewish norms where a certain land, Israel, is holiest and other lands don't hold that same kind of sanctity. There's a way in which when I bring up that presumption and I question it and I'm in conversation with folks who are trans, there's sort of an intuitive like, oh, okay, let's work with this. Like I'm somebody who questions the gender binary and now we're questioning another binary, Israel versus everywhere else. And I think that the same muscle that does that is the muscle that says, oh, we're not we're going to look at everything about men and women, and we're going to broaden that to include the full spectrum, the full continuum of what it is to hold a human gender or to not. That's an important muscle that I believe through trans leadership of Jewish conversations, we can begin flexing and exercising in whatever proverbial weight rooms we need. And then, with the muscles we've built, building communities that are thriving.
I can imagine this episode, and maybe if this episode, then maybe all of our episodes, I can imagine somebody listening to this in 100 years just being like, what was the issue back then? I'm thinking about how I've mentioned before that my wife and I have been doing the daily Talmud page every day, Daf Yomi, studying a page of Talmud every morning. My motivation is basically just to be completely aware of what's in it. And there is a huge ton of material about sacrifices. We read that and we're just kind of mystified by it. By the way, that stuff was written hundreds of years after the sacrifices ended. So it's also a question of whether this stuff I've started to question to what extent this stuff actually really happened. But anyway, the point is that you read something like that a long time later and you're like, what were they debating? Like, what was this? This is something that we haven't done for thousands of years. Why are we still reading this? And I can imagine a world where people look at gender and the gender binary that way. And just say, like, of course gender is on a spectrum, on a continuum. And, that's just the way it is. And I think about my own children and how their conception of gender is completely different from mine. When they hear that somebody is transitioned from one binary to the other, they're completely uninterested. They're just like, oh, that's interesting. They're completely uninterested. They just say, like, oh, that's new information I received. When they meet people who are gender fluid, they use they and them as naturally as people of our generation use he and she. It's of no consequence to them. And I imagine that their children, and certainly their grandchildren, will just be puzzled by the very question. And so the question is, let's say, for example, as a thought experiment, you accept our premise that it will be that way in 100 years. Then what should we be doing in this time to help build that future where not only we're going to get more quickly to the point where people think this is a silly question to be asking, but where we're not setting up Jewish practices and Jewish institutions in such a way that is going to be in conflict with that way that the world is going to be in 100 years. That's a recipe for disaster. My sense is the rapidity of the acceptance by young people of all the various ideas about trans identity, that the way that is being accepted so quickly among my children and the younger generation is an indication that is going to be the future, which we celebrate. But our institutions are still operating at the level of trying to be more inclusive, as opposed to, investing tremendous amounts of money and time and energy in trans leaders who might be starting the process of envisioning that new future. And I would call out the Trans Halacha Project of Sfara as an example of an institutional approach that is what we can imagine many other institutions might look like, that would be starting to lay the foundations for what simply will be in 100 years.
Yeah, I mean, the 100-year timeline is absolutely one way to look at this. I think we could be even looking at the, 10-year, 20-year timeline, and not
Next
a
year.
small amount of change in the time. I think some issues we talk about, we're used to going the 100-year route because it's hard to see how in 10 years there will really be that much shift. There might be the beginnings of a shift. On this, your kids are, they're young, but they're not that young. One of them's going to college, Baruch Hashem, all of those great things. And whenever we as an organization interact with, I'm going to sound so old, with the young people, when we have our, our fellowship with New Voices Magazine, which is a by and for college student organization, when we've had our various applications for those fellowships, a huge percentage of our applicants have used they, them pronouns. When we interact with organizations, when we partner with them on initiatives of whatever kind, and their demographic base is younger people, especially in the Jewish world, there are a lot of people who are trans and non-binary already. This is a present tense situation, and that's awesome. And what I think that points to, by the way, is the need for intergenerational relationships on everything, but on this issue especially. I mean, if your typical 60, 70, 80-year-old who's involved in Jewish life today had sincere, close relationships, not just with their own grandchildren, or I mean, not all those people have grandchildren, obviously, but if those people had sincere, close relationships with even 10, 20-year-olds, it is exceedingly likely that they would have sincere, close relationships with somebody who is trans, who is non-binary. That's just the truth when you look around at the Jewish world. And so the fact that that's not yet the case, we can say, which is true, older generations need to reflect and do better, but we also, across all generations, should be asking, why haven't we done a better job of creating relationships across age divides? I think about that a lot. On paper, if people were to ask me what is the skill set of organized religion? People love to talk about organized religion. I think most religion is extremely disorganized, including the organizations, but they still organized religion. What are the skills of it? What are the ways in which it contributes to society that are different from the rest of society? I have been able to build relationships with people whose age is very far from mine more effectively in religious spaces, in Jewish spaces, than anywhere else. Many of the organizations that we rightly call to change lots of things, that's where I have found elders. And if those elders in return, and I think many of them do, by the way, I think this is shifting, but if there was a way in which those elders had relationships with folks who are younger, a lot of this would change organically. Because the second you need your synagogue's policies or its norms to shift because you love your friend and they're not feeling welcome, it becomes your problem. It's not just somebody else's problem. It's your problem. That's a piece of this issue that I don't think we always recognize. I mean, that all was planted because Becky Silverstein, when he was a guest on our show, he mentioned in trans spaces, he was the only person over 30 that a bunch of younger folks had met. That was the oldest trans person they had interacted with. There are other folks much older who have done really important work to pave the way for trans folks today and the future. But given that we have this space that is disproportionately younger, how might it be that transcending age divides actually serves the project of transcending our issues around gender inclusion and empowerment too?
It makes me think about, and I think I've mentioned this before on the show, this experience that I once had on the synagogue's education committee. We went around the room saying, what are your aspirations for education? And when it got around to me, I said, well, I think we should start with an assumption that the vast majority of our children are going to marry somebody who's not Jewish, and our education should be one that helps them live a meaningful Jewish life in that context. People looked at me like I was a little not what they were expecting somebody to say it should be the orientation of our education system and everything. But my point is kind of saying, if you want to have a relationship with your grandchildren, or if you want to be thought of as heroically by your great-grandchildren or something, you should assume that a lot of them are going to be trans. And so what does that mean in terms of how one might orient themselves to the world? And to say, like, look, this is actually a large proportion of our population. And by the way, there's been for a long time, but it wasn't accepted. And so people were trans before, but they couldn't say so, or certain conceptions weren't available to people to describe themselves. I'm not saying this is a growing percentage of the population. I'm saying it's always been large, and people just haven't necessarily known how to express that, or knew they wouldn't be accepted, et cetera, et cetera. So in a world in which that hopefully has broken down to a large extent, such that people are definitely already and more will be publicly trans, people are going to have to understand that this is what my family is. And we all are going to have to imagine that what does a world look like? Everybody wants the world to be one that their family can thrive in. So what does a world look like in which these many family members of mine who are trans are going to thrive in? Now, I want to just mention that I think that this question about the gender binary, for me, has raised all these other binaries, and I want to make that other connection to the little story that I opened with about being on this committee talking about how most of our children are going to marry someone who's not Jewish. Even that itself is a binary, right? The binary of Jew and non-Jew. I've come to see that binary very differently over the last 5 or 10 years, and to me, I don't think it's actually necessarily an important or the most important way to think about what Judaism is and how a person might identify with it. But once we have an understanding that I think a real grappling with the topic that we've been talking about here in terms of people of trans experience in terms of gender, I hope also just blows open that question of what are all the other binaries that we are locked into that are actually causing us a lot of damage by not understanding that those binaries are false.
What's funny is if we did the same exercise of looking at traditional Jewish sources, and just as there are precedents in rabbinic text for genders or that are not quite the gender binary that Western society has accepted, there's also precedent for people that are on the precipice of the Jew, non-Jew binary that are located somewhere in between on that spectrum. And there are people who are embedded in Jewish life, who are not Jewish, who don't identify as Jewish, but who absolutely are part of the project. And so I think that all of the things that we do to unpack exactly the differences between who's a Jew, who's not, what's required to convert, what's not, whose parentage is valid and whose isn't, what percentage is, how do we that whole thing, I do believe will of necessity dissolve when we no longer accept one binary, you're male, you're female. When we upend that idea, we're going to have to upend other ideas that resemble it. And I do believe that the idea, it's not a binary, right? Religion has not been seen as a binary, but in a sense, because there's Judaism, there's Christianity, there's Islam, there's more than two, right?
Except historically, Jews have really kind of said Jew and non-Jew.
Yeah, right. No, we're deficient in recognizing the multiplicity of ways that one can be not a Jew. That's certainly true. But there is a way in which each one of them is its own binary. Christian, non-Christian. You can look at all the ways the Christian texts talk about people who haven't accepted Jesus who aren't Christian. You can look at Muslim texts, which have all sorts of delineations around people who are Muslim and not. You could there are some traditions that do less of this, and we could get into that. But those, I'll say those three certainly do. And is it serving us? Is it serving us to require people when they convert through even the Reform movement to say that they will practice Judaism to the exclusion of all other religions? That is actually a thing that people say as part of I'm calling it an oath. That seems like too strong a language, but basically you say a bunch of words as part of your conversion to Judaism from something else. And one of them is that you will practice Judaism to the exclusion of all other religions. What? Does that hold up when you're a Jew in a household with somebody who isn't Jewish, whether that person is Muslim or is sharing a Christmas celebration with that? You could say, oh, well, you're not practicing Christianity when you do that. You're just sort of, once again, an ally to their thing. That's not how I conceptualize what's happening. When I'm sharing something with a loved one For me, this is people have different ways of conceptualizing this. I am doing the thing. When we explode the idea that that one must sort of locate themselves in one of the clear-cut boxes of gender, and there are two of them, I think we're going to have to explode other things, and that makes me happy, actually. That makes me excited, because I believe the Judaisms that would result, that are trying to do the universal design game, not just for Jews, but for all humanity, who are trying to craft Passover and Purim and Shavuot and Shabbos and everything with folks who aren't Jewish in mind too. It's not that we need to center non-Jews. I think it's a different question, because they're not looking to be centered if they don't identify as Jews. But at the very least, for them to be part of the conversation would be good.
For sure. And in looking at what might happen as a result of all this, or what we would hope that will happen as a result of all this, I think about what we've been saying, which is that, I have this fundamental belief that if the Jewish community really invests in and catalyzes and helps and is allies to a whole world of trans-driven organizations and projects, we will actually end up with a much more wonderful Judaism. And maybe there's an opportunity for those of us who, in this case, are not trans, to contribute something to those new organizations that are built by and for the folks who have been historically more marginalized than we have. And I'm thinking about Judaism itself as a project of the marginalized. It feels to me like there's a lot of stuff within Judaism of the nature of, remember how oppressed we were, and let's make sure that we build a model society where we won't oppress anybody else. And I'm not sure how well we've done. I think we've done well in certain times, in certain places, and in certain instances, but I'm not sure, right? Like, again, I think I've said this before, but I wish that the Jewish demographic surveys, right, instead of asking how many times a year do you light Shabbat candles as a kind of indicator of how Jewish you are, that they would ask, how many times in the year do you give money to a homeless person, or do you give money to a charity, not necessarily a Jewish charity? In other words, how many times a year do you treat somebody as if they were an image of God? Or how many times a year do you work for justice in the world because we've experienced so much injustice? And those are not those questions that tend to be asked on those demographic surveys. I am inspired by the thinking about this potential new world that, in this case, trans Jews might create, to think about other versions of ideal new worlds that we all might be able to build together. That hopefully will eventually all kind of mush together in the future into this amazing Judaism that maybe for the first time fully and fundamentally lives up to its mission of treating people as if they're created in the image of God, of caring for the oppressed because we were once oppressed. However you want to put those initial mission statements, I actually can imagine this new world being the one that most lives up to it, which brings me back around to what I understood Binya to be saying, which was that, if I fundamentally believe that Judaism is about a certain thing and makes a certain set of claims, in her case, it was the claim of the oneness of all things. In my case, it's some of these other principles, that I understand that new world that's going to be built is not an atraditional world, untraditional world. It's the most traditional world, even though in many cases it might look different, which of course brings me back to that story about Moses being sent in a time machine to see the future Judaism and not understanding anything that he was seeing, and then ultimately hearing Rabbi Akiva say that it was Torah from Moses at Sinai, and Moses is relieved to hear that. In other words, it doesn't look anything like what he recognizes, but he still understands that it's in the chain, and maybe actually the most true to that chain that there ever was.
Yeah, well, I do want to mention, this is going to feel like a sidebar, but you mentioned, asking the wrong questions in surveys. First off, we're going to be talking a little bit about the Pew study that was released recently soon. If anybody was wondering why we didn't yet, that's coming. But one thing that's important to mention is this Pew study that came out, that was done in 2020 and released in 2021, the two options, and there were two, for gender were male and female. Literally, this study did not provide any form of opportunity for, whether through a checkbox of non-binary, whether through a fill in the blank of some other gender, they had no option for that. And I brought that up to them, and they have committed publicly that that will not be the case whenever this next study happens. And I hope that all of us hold them accountable, because that is unacceptable. How we draw categories in every respect has implications for how we for how these studies play out. And then how these studies play out has implications for what's funded, what isn't funded. And like the fact that we have literally no data related to folks who are non-binary. I'm not going to say we have no data about trans people, because some people who are trans do identify as male or as female, just a gender that they were not assigned at birth. So some of them indicated through male or female. But like if you receive that survey and you're non-binary, you have two options: choose a gender that you don't feel is true, that isn't true, or don't do the survey. And my guess is plenty of people didn't do the survey. Given that gender intersects with all sorts of other issues, as we've been talking about, that means we don't have the voices of people we literally believe need to be on the forefront of the Jewish future in our primary Jewish study. And that's so unacceptable that we've got to say it before the end of this episode. Okay, so that's one piece. I love the way that you talked about what I would term like Jewish memory and the Jewish past. I mean, you talked about how like it could be that that Judaism has never achieved what it is designed to achieve, if we treat what it's designed to achieve as sort of the full equality and empowerment of all people. But like, I want to sit with the past a little more. This is something that I think comes up with how LGBTQ organizations, how people look at the Jewish past, because there is a way in which like it's important to find in rabbinic text, in Torah text, and otherwise hints, allusions to one's self. And I say that I say that as me. Like I when I'm engaging in any work of literature or film or otherwise, I'm hoping to see elements of myself and learn a little bit about myself through that portrayal. And that's why representation is important. We could talk all about that, and we have. There's a way in which people who are trans look to Torah text, and especially to rabbinic text. I mean, one famous example that I forget if this came up in our conversations, but like there's a story of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, who are generally read as two male rabbis who have a really close-knit relationship, really close-knit. It's not so much of a stretch to read it as a relationship of lovers. Like I don't think that that's particularly creative as a reading. What you could argue is a little more creative is many people have read Yochanan for a variety of reasons as being not a man, as being a trans woman. He, or I'm going to say she, is described in a number of ways that feel feminized in how we tend to draw categories of gender. And there are people, including some of our past guests, who talk about Rabbi Yochanan as a trans Jewish matriarch. I think there are people who, maybe listeners of this show, maybe people that are, not regressive folks, who would look at that and be like, wait, why? Like, I get that we need to do better now, but why are we sort of looking at these ancient texts and pretending that that's what they were doing? Like the authors of the Talmud probably didn't intend to do that, which who knows? What I want to name is it's also an act. It's not a passive thing. If we claim Yochanan as a cisgender male, that's a choice. We happen to make that choice with virtually everybody who's featured in Jewish text. We need to start thinking not only on the future, but in the past, how we tell that story, because in building our better Jewish world in the future, our more trans, more awesome Jewish world in the future, we're going to need to leverage the Jewish past. And understanding that doing so is not some like extremist act of changing the tradition. It's the extremely traditional act. Like we need that premise as we do this work.
Whatever you want to say about whether Rabbi Yochanan was actually a trans woman, or that's something that we're going to tell as a new story today because of all kinds of signs, like this is what Judaism does. This is how it works. People, this is how it works.
Absolutely. So we're going to close out on that note. Please, I know we said this at the beginning, but please listen to the earlier episodes in this series. This is the 8th episode in the series. So it's a big ask to say listen to all of them. I really hope if this is your first time listening in a while that you at least listen to a couple of the previous episodes in this series. But we're going to close out, and as we do so, we're going to just encourage you to be in touch with us however you would like to, and here are all the different ways you can. There are our social media handles through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. All of those are just at Judaism Unbound. You can head to our website, JudaismUnbound.com, and you can email us at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. We really, really have enjoyed this unit of conversations. We're excited to keep on trucking with our next conversations, and we hope that you'll journey there with us. The last note we'd like to make is that support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Ashman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Ashman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.